Emily Dawson was the kind of woman most people overlooked. If you walked into one of her classrooms, you'd see her standing at the front, wearing her simple cardigan, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, and a stack of books tucked neatly under her arm. She spoke with a calm voice, one that could make even the driest topics feel poetic. Her students liked her, not because she was flashy or entertaining, but because she had a quiet kindness about her that made them feel seen. Emily Dawson wasn't the loudest person in the room, but those who paid attention always walked away with something to remember. To anyone else, though, Emily was easy to dismiss. She wasn't tall, didn't have a commanding presence, and didn't wear the kind of clothes that made people stop and look twice. She blended into crowds without effort, like a shadow at sunset. In grocery stores or waiting in line at coffee shops, strangers often brushed right past her, barely noticing she was there. For many, she was just another woman, one of those people you couldn't describe if someone asked. And Emily didn't mind. She liked her quiet life. She loved teaching college students about literature, helping them see stories not just as words on a page but as windows to a bigger world. Shakespeare, Jane Austen, even Edgar Allan Poe, her lectures made these voices come alive, full of passion and mystery. To her, these books were full of people who weren't what they seemed, kings who disguised themselves as beggars, villains hiding behind smiles, and quiet heroes waiting for their moment. If anyone had asked Emily what kind of person she was, she'd smile softly and say, just someone who loves words. But the truth was far more interesting. Emily had another life, one she rarely talked about. It wasn't a secret exactly, but it was something most people didn't think to ask. After all, no one looks at a college professor and thinks, I wonder if she's married to someone dangerous. The people who knew Emily closely would describe her as steady, dependable, and fiercely loyal. They might mention her husband, Mike, to a man who seemed as opposite to her as day to night. Where Emily was soft-spoken, Mike was bold. Where she lived in books and ideas, Mike lived in the real world, where instincts could save your life. A former Navy SEAL, Mike had seen things that most people couldn't even imagine. War zones, rescue missions, survival tactics. His life was a series of battles and victories. When Mike and Emily met years ago, their friends didn't understand the match. What does a soldier have in common with a bookworm? Someone once asked. But Mike had seen something in Emily that no one else could see: strength. It was quiet, tucked away behind her gentle eyes, but it was there. And Emily? She admired Mike's discipline, his loyalty, and his unshakable sense of purpose. He taught her things she never thought she'd learn, things no college classroom could offer. Still, Emily rarely thought about those lessons. For the most part, her life in their sleepy little town was peaceful. She spent her mornings driving to campus with the radio humming softly in the background. Her afternoons were spent grading papers or preparing her next lecture. At night, she and Mike would sit together, eating dinner while laughing over something silly like how she could never remember to gas up her car, or how Mike, the big tough SEAL, was afraid of mice. The world they built together was ordinary and happy. Emily liked it that way. But life has a funny way of testing people when they least expect it. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those dull, gray afternoons where the sky hung heavy with clouds, and the roads were slick from the morning rain. Emily had stayed late at the college to meet with a student who needed extra help. By the time she gathered her things and made her way to the parking lot, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the campus quiet and still. She unlocked her little blue sedan, tossed her bag into the passenger seat, and climbed in. The engine sputtered to life, and as she pulled out onto the road, she let out a small sigh. It had been a long day, and all she wanted was to go home, curl up on the couch with a book, and wait for Mike to come home. The drive home should have been routine. She knew the back roads well, the winding curves, the stretches where streetlights were few and far between. Normally, she found the drive peaceful, a time to think and unwind. But tonight, something felt different. It started with headlights in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't think much of it. Cars shared the road all the time. But when she slowed for a stop sign and the vehicle behind her didn't, when it stayed just a little too close, its headlights glaring into her mirror, Emily's fingers tightened on the wheel. She kept driving, her eyes flicking up now and then to check the mirrors. The headlights followed, uncomfortably close. And then, as she rounded a corner onto a darker stretch of road, she saw them for what they were: motorcycles. 4 of them. The bikes roared like thunder as they surrounded her car, one pulling up beside her on the left, another cutting close to the back. She could see the riders now, men in dark jackets, faces mostly hidden by helmets. One of them turned his head to look at her, and though she couldn't see his face, she felt it like a predator sizing up its prey. Emily's heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. She pressed down on the gas pedal gently, picking up speed. Maybe they'd lose interest. Maybe this was nothing. A silly coincidence. But the bikers stayed with her. One of them revved his engine loudly, the sound so sharp it made her flinch. Another swerved dangerously close to her car, almost grazing the side. Emily's hands gripped the wheel harder, her knuckles white. Stay calm, she thought. Just stay calm. She could hear Mike's voice in her head, steady and clear. Rule number 1: don't panic. Panic makes you sloppy. Emily forced herself to breathe evenly. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty. She thought of stopping, but the thought of pulling over on this isolated road with 4 bikers around her made her skin crawl. So she kept going, her mind racing through her options. The biker to her left leaned closer to her window. Through the glass, she could hear his muffled shout, "Hey, lady. Where you headed?" Emily didn't answer. They were playing with her now, swerving close, revving their engines, circling her car like wolves around a deer. But what they didn't know was that Emily wasn't just another helpless target. She didn't look like someone who knew how to handle herself, but looks can be deceiving. Emily's heart raced, but her mind stayed sharp. Think, she told herself. What would Mike say? Always know your surroundings. Use what you have. Her eyes scanned the road ahead. The bikers were close, far too close. And as Emily looked out into the darkness, she made a decision, one that would take them by surprise. Her foot eased off the gas. The bikers didn't expect it. One of them, caught off guard, wobbled slightly as her car slowed down. The space tightened. For a moment, they were closer than they intended. And Emily smiled faintly. Because she remembered what Mike had told her the first time he took her out to teach her how to drive defensively: sometimes, you don't need to outrun trouble. You just need to outsmart it. And these bikers? They had no idea who they were messing with. Emily's sedan hummed steadily as it moved down the dark road, her thoughts sharp and focused. She could feel the adrenaline building, but instead of clouding her mind, it was sharpening her senses. Every sound: her tires on the damp pavement, the low growl of the motorcycles, the thrum of her own heartbeat seemed louder. The biker closest to her window knocked on the glass again. Knock. Knock. It wasn't hard, but it sent a chill through her anyway. Not because she was scared, no, Emily wasn't scared yet, but because she understood something about these men. They thought they were in control. Roll the window down, lady, one of them shouted, his muffled voice carrying through the glass. Emily's lips tightened into a thin line. She ignored him. The biker swerved even closer, and for a moment, she feared he might try to grab the door handle. Her fingers tightened on the wheel again, and she adjusted her posture. Mike had taught her about body language, how even the way you sat in a chair could change the outcome of a situation. Right now, she was sitting straighter, shoulders back. Rule number 2, Mike's voice echoed in her memory: control the space around you. Make them work for it. Her foot shifted on the accelerator, gently increasing her speed. The sedan picked up momentum, and she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The bikers noticed. "Whoa, slow down," one of them called, laughing like it was all a game. The sound of their engines roared louder as they matched her speed, but Emily didn't flinch. Her car glided around the next bend in the road, smooth and controlled, while the bikers weaved around her like sharks circling prey. They were testing her. Emily knew what this was, a game of intimidation. A cruel little performance where they hoped to scare her, maybe make her pull over. She'd read about things like this in the news before. Lonely roads. Late nights. Women driving alone. But these bikers didn't know who they were dealing with. Years ago, on a different kind of road, one surrounded by the hot, unrelenting sun of a desert, Mike had told her something that she would never forget. They'd been on one of their weekend drives, where Mike liked to teach her about survival and situational awareness. "You don't wait for someone else to save you, Em," he'd said, his blue eyes steady on hers. "Not when you're out here. If trouble comes, you think. You move. And you don't let them see fear." Mike had lived by those words in some of the most dangerous places in the world. He'd brought that discipline home with him, weaving it into their lives, teaching Emily things that most people never learned. At the time, Emily had laughed and said, "Mike, I'm a college professor, not a soldier." And Mike had smiled, a little sadly, and replied, "Sometimes, life doesn't care who you are. It tests you anyway." She never forgot that. And now, on this dark road, Emily realized that Mike had been right. Life was testing her. As Emily's car approached a stretch of road where the trees grew thick and the shadows were darker, the bikers grew bolder. One of them moved to the front of her car, slowing down deliberately to force her speed to drop. Another pulled alongside her again, tapping the side of her car with his gloved hand. Tap. 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 It was deliberate. Taunting. Emily's jaw tightened. Her mind raced through everything Mike had taught her. She could feel the lessons rising to the surface of her memory like oil bubbling to the top of water. If they box you in, don't panic. A moving car is a weapon. Just remember, control. She knew she couldn't let them force her to stop. Pulling over would be the worst mistake she could make. Whatever game these men thought they were playing, they weren't going to win. Her gaze flicked to the mirrors again. The road stretched out behind her, empty and quiet. No headlights in sight. No help. But Emily didn't need help. "Come on, lady," one of the bikers yelled, his voice full of mockery as he pounded his fist against her window again. "You scared? Huh?" Emily's eyes stayed locked on the road. Another memory surfaced, clearer this time. It was Mike teaching her how to maneuver through tight spots, how to stay ahead of trouble. They'd been in an empty parking lot, using orange cones as obstacles. "Think of the car as an extension of yourself," Mike had said, standing beside her window, watching her as she practiced weaving through the cones. "It's not just metal and wheels. It's a tool. A shield if you need it. Or a weapon if they push you too far." At the time, Emily hadn't fully understood what he meant. But now, in this moment, it made perfect sense. "They're trying to corner me," she thought. "But I'm not going to let them." Emily's expression stayed calm as she ran through her options. She could feel the bikers' confidence growing, they were getting reckless, cocky even. They thought she was just another woman, helpless, fragile, afraid. They were wrong. She took a deep breath and adjusted her grip on the wheel. Her mind was sharp now, her pulse steady. "All right," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the car engine. "Let's see how you like this." Without warning, Emily slammed her foot on the brakes. The sedan's tires screeched against the wet pavement, the sudden force throwing the bikers into disarray. The one who had been leading directly in front of her car swerved violently to avoid being hit, nearly losing control of his bike. His shout of surprise echoed through the night as he fought to steady himself. The others scattered, startled by her unexpected move. Emily didn't wait for them to recover. The second the bikers were out of position, she hit the gas, her car lurching forward with a roar. The sudden acceleration caught them off guard again. One of the bikers on her left cursed loudly as she sped past him, her sedan gliding through the open space she'd created. "Control the space around you." Mike's words echoed in her mind again. Emily's heart was pounding now, but not with fear. It was something else, something sharper. A mix of focus and resolve. The road ahead was open, and she took full advantage, pushing the car faster. The speedometer climbed higher, the engine humming steadily as the dark road zipped past her windows. In her rearview mirror, she could see the bikers struggling to catch up, their headlights growing smaller with each second. Good, she thought. Let them chase me. I'll be ready. The stretch of road ahead curved slightly to the right, and Emily spotted something she'd been hoping for, an off-road turn that led toward an old gravel lot. It wasn't a place she would usually go, but right now, it was perfect. Time to change the game, she thought. She flicked on her turn signal not because she needed to, but because she wanted the bikers to see it. The instant she turned off the main road, the sedan's tires crunched over loose gravel. She felt the car jolt slightly under her control, but she kept it steady, navigating the uneven ground as she sped deeper into the lot. The gravel stretched wide, bordered by trees on one side and an empty chain-link fence on the other. In the distance, she could hear the motorcycles roaring closer. The bikers were following her, just as she expected. Emily's lips pressed into a firm line. If they follow, use the terrain. Make them uncomfortable. Make them work for every inch. The lot was dark, but she knew she could use that to her advantage. The bikers weren't expecting her to fight back, much less make smart moves. Emily guided the car into a quick turn, the tires skidding slightly as she doubled back. Her headlights swept across the gravel, momentarily blinding one of the bikers as they entered the lot after her. She saw him veer off course, struggling to stay upright. The first sign of trouble was a distant, low rumble. Emily Dawson didn't notice it at first. Her thoughts were still lingering on the day's lecture and the conversation she'd had with one of her students about symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird. But as the sound grew louder, like distant thunder rolling toward her, she felt it more than heard it. She glanced into her rearview mirror. At first, she saw nothing but darkness and the empty road stretching out behind her, faintly lit by the glow of her tail lights. She exhaled, brushing off the uneasy feeling. But then, there it was again. That rumble. VRRRRRMM. The sound of engines. When she checked her mirror a second time, they appeared. 4 motorcycles emerged out of the darkness, their headlights cutting sharp beams into the night. They were still far back, but something about the way they moved unsettled her. They weren't just traveling down the same road, they were spreading out, taking up the entire lane as they closed the distance. Emily frowned slightly, her knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. It's fine, she told herself. It's just a group of bikers. They're probably on their way somewhere. But deep down, she felt it. That ripple of tension. A few minutes later, the bikers were right behind her. Their headlights filled her mirrors, bright and blinding. Emily's sedan felt small, too small, as the roar of their engines surrounded her, vibrating through the air like a swarm of angry hornets. She checked the speedometer. She was going just over the speed limit, steady and cautious. There was no reason for them to be so close. But they were. One of the bikers suddenly revved his engine, a loud, sharp growl that made Emily flinch. She glanced nervously into the rearview mirror and saw them, 4 men, their faces hidden behind dark helmets, dressed in worn leather jackets. They rode side by side, taking up the road, moving as one. The biker on the far right swerved closer to her car, cutting into the space behind her right tail light. The movement was deliberate, playful, almost like a predator testing its prey. Emily's grip on the wheel tightened. Her breathing grew shallow, and she forced herself to focus on the road. The bikers weren't doing anything yet, but their presence alone was enough to set her on edge. They weren't just passing through, and she knew it. Seconds passed slowly, stretching into what felt like minutes. Another engine revved. VRRRRM. It was closer this time, almost like a warning. The biker on the left crept up beside her, his front wheel just behind her driver's side window. Emily dared to glance sideways. In the faint glow of her headlights reflecting off his bike, she could see him tall, broad-shouldered, leaning forward slightly as he rode. His helmet obscured his face, but she could feel his eyes on her. He lifted one hand off the handlebars and gave a slow wave, fingers wiggling mockingly. Emily swallowed hard. Her chest tightened as a spike of fear shot through her. She looked back at the road ahead. The highway was empty, no other cars, no signs of houses or lights. Just a long stretch of dark pavement cutting through the trees on either side. She pressed her foot on the gas just a little, trying to widen the space between her and the bikers. For a moment, it worked. The growl of their engines faded slightly. But it didn't last. One of the bikers, this one on her right, shot forward suddenly, his motorcycle roaring as he sped past her. He swerved into her lane just ahead of her car, forcing Emily to tap the brakes to avoid getting too close. The biker in front slowed down deliberately, holding his position as if blocking her path. Her pulse quickened. Two more bikers pulled up alongside her car, one on the left and one on the right. The fourth stayed behind, tailgating her so close she couldn't see his headlight anymore, just darkness filling her rearview mirror. They had her surrounded. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Her hands were clammy now, and her knuckles had gone white on the steering wheel. The bikers weren't shouting or saying anything, but their intentions were clear in the way they moved, deliberate, slow, menacing. One of the men swerved closer, his bike inching toward her door. The sound of his engine was deafening. Emily's breath hitched as he knocked on her window with his knuckles. Tap. 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 "Hey there, lady," he shouted, his voice muffled by his helmet and the roar of the bike. "Where you headed tonight?" She ignored him. Her eyes stayed locked on the road ahead. The biker knocked on the glass again, harder this time. Tap. 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 "I'm talking to you." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, fighting to keep her breathing steady. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind, but she forced it back down. Don't panic, she thought. Think. The men were playing with her. Testing her. And while they hadn't done anything violent yet, their behavior spoke volumes. They were trying to intimidate her. See if she'd break. The biker in front of her slammed on his brakes for just a split second, forcing her to react. Emily's foot hit the brake pedal instinctively, and her sedan jolted as it slowed. A loud laugh erupted from one of the bikers outside. "Easy there, sweetheart," the man on her left shouted. His voice was mocking, almost sing-song, like he was enjoying himself. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears. This isn't happening, she thought. It can't be happening. But it was. The bikers swerved around her car again, engines roaring as they circled her. The man behind her flashed his high beams, flooding her cabin with bright white light. Emily squinted, her jaw tightening. They were trying to disorient her. Her mind raced as she fought to keep her focus on the road. What did they want? Was this just some cruel game? Or was it worse than that? A voice echoed in her head, Mike's voice, calm and steady. Rule number 1, don't show fear. Fear makes them bold. Fear gives them power. She sat up a little straighter in her seat. Her knuckles were still white, but her breathing slowed as she forced herself to think clearly. What do I do? The biker to her right knocked on the window again, harder this time. You deaf, lady, he shouted. Roll it down. Emily's hands didn't move. She didn't look at him. She knew better than to engage. Mike had warned her about people like this, people who tested boundaries, who wanted to see how far they could push. The moment you gave them a reaction, you were playing into their hands. The biker cursed loudly when she didn't respond, his voice muffled but sharp. Up ahead, the road stretched on into more darkness, with no exits in sight. Emily's mind raced through her options. She couldn't pull over, that would be a mistake. She couldn't turn around, either, not with 4 bikers blocking her in. Her best option was to keep moving, stay calm, and wait for an opening. The biker in front of her slowed again, forcing her speed to drop. The other 3 closed in tighter around her, their engines growling like wild animals. Emily's heart was pounding, but her expression remained steady. What these men didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Emily Dawson was not the fragile, helpless woman they thought she was. Years of quiet lessons from her husband had prepared her for this. The thought of Mike steadied her nerves. He'd taught her how to keep a cool head, how to plan, how to act quickly and decisively when the moment called for it. And most importantly, he'd taught her that she was stronger than she looked. They wanted to intimidate her, to make her feel small and afraid. But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. Not now. The roar of the engines was deafening now, surrounding Emily like a violent storm. The bikers didn't let up. They flanked her on either side, swerved dangerously close, and flashed their high beams into her mirrors. It was a coordinated game of intimidation, one they clearly thought they were winning. The biker to her left knocked on her window again, harder this time. The sound made her jump despite herself, but her face stayed neutral. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Roll it down, lady, he shouted, his voice muffled by the helmet. Come on, don't be rude. Emily's breathing slowed as she tightened her grip on the wheel. She didn't answer. She didn't look. Mike's words echoed in her head again. Stay calm. Control your breathing. If you panic, they win. The biker cursed under his breath when she ignored him. He revved his engine angrily, his motorcycle roaring like an animal ready to pounce. Up ahead, the road remained empty, stretching endlessly into darkness. No streetlights. No exits. No signs of help anywhere. Just blackness. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, but her mind was sharpening now. Panic had no place here. The lead biker, the one in front of her car, suddenly jerked his bike sideways. He slammed his brakes again, forcing her to slow even more. Emily eased off the gas pedal but didn't slam the brakes that would give him exactly what he wanted. Think, Emily, she whispered to herself, keeping her eyes steady on the road. Her headlights hit the back of the biker's jacket. Even from here, she could see a large, crude skull patch on his back, grinning, hollow-eyed, with Death Vultures written across the top in jagged white letters. Death Vultures. The name sent a chill down her spine. Mike had mentioned gangs like this before, nomadic biker gangs that moved from state to state, leaving trouble in their wake. Violence, theft, intimidation. They weren't organized like larger criminal groups, they thrived on chaos. These men didn't look for reasons to cause problems, they were the problem. The biker to her right swerved closer again, his bike nearly brushing her car. She heard the metallic clink of something hitting the side of her sedan. They're testing me. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The biker behind her was tailgating so closely that his front tire nearly touched her bumper. If she braked too hard, he'd slam into her. The other 2 bikers, one on each side, were grinning under their helmets. Emily could feel it even if she couldn't see their faces. They weren't in any hurry to let her go. "All right, lady, we're just having fun here," the biker to her left called out. He leaned closer to the window as he rode alongside her, his voice mocking and sing-song. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Emily stared straight ahead, refusing to look at him. "Ah, come on," he taunted. "At least smile for us. You're not too scared, are ya?" Her stomach turned, but she kept her face blank. Inside, though, her instincts were flaring. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to slam on the gas and speed away, but she knew better. With bikers on all sides, a sudden move could end in disaster. She needed to wait. She needed an opportunity. The biker beside her pounded on the window with his fist this time, the sound sharp and jarring. Wham! 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 "Answer me when I talk to you," he shouted. Emily flinched but stayed silent. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly now that her fingers ached, but she didn't let go. She wouldn't let them win. Mike's voice whispered in her memory again, calm and steady as always. "Don't let them push you into a mistake. You're smarter than they are." She repeated the words silently to herself. "You're smarter than they are." The lead biker ahead of her slowed even more now, his motorcycle barely coasting. He was forcing her to match his speed, and the two bikers beside her weren't giving her any room to maneuver. They had her boxed in like wolves herding a deer. Emily felt her pulse racing. "What do you want from me?" she finally muttered under her breath, though she knew they couldn't hear her. She hated how helpless she felt at this moment, hated how they toyed with her. But deep inside, that helplessness was giving way to something else, something stronger. Anger. They had no idea who she was. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And they certainly had no idea who had taught her how to handle situations like this. Emily took a steadying breath, her mind beginning to clear. The biker on her right banged on her window again, harder this time. "Stop the car," he yelled. Her heart leaped. Stop the car? No. That wasn't going to happen. Her foot hovered over the gas pedal instinctively, but she caught herself. No sudden moves yet. She needed to outthink them. Reacting in anger or panic would give them control, and she refused to give it up. The lead biker's head turned slightly as if looking over his shoulder at her. Then, to her disbelief, he lifted his left hand and pointed to the side of the road. He wanted her to pull over. A cold chill washed over her skin. The game was changing now. They were done playing with her. Emily's breath quickened, but her face remained calm, blank. She shook her head slightly, whispering to herself. No. I won't do it. The biker to her left noticed her hesitation and leaned closer. You deaf, lady? He said, pull over. Emily didn't respond. She tightened her grip on the wheel instead. The man's tone changed now, turning darker. You don't want to make us mad, sweetheart. His words sent a jolt of fear through her, but another feeling quickly followed, determination. They wanted her to stop, but she wouldn't. She couldn't. Instead, she started to think about her options. The lead biker slowed even further, almost to a crawl. Emily's sedan sputtered slightly as she eased on the brakes to avoid hitting him. The men flanking her boxed her in tighter, cutting off any escape. But as they crowded closer, something shifted inside her. She felt calm. Cold. Focused. Mike's training returned to her, every lesson coming back in sharp detail. When they think they're in control, that's when you strike. You don't fight their game, you make them play yours. Emily's lips pressed into a firm line. She didn't have much room to move, but she still had a car and a plan was forming. The biker on her right knocked on the window again, harder and louder. You're running out of chances, he barked. Pull over now. Emily didn't look at him. She didn't say a word. Instead, her foot pressed down gently at first on the gas pedal. The car surged forward just a bit, enough to make the lead biker take notice. He turned his head sharply, trying to gauge her intentions. She watched him closely, her eyes narrowing. The biker behind her, still tailgating dangerously, revved his engine aggressively. Emily could feel him trying to intimidate her into compliance. But instead of backing down, she made her move. Her foot hit the gas hard. The car jolted forward suddenly, tires screeching against the pavement. The lead biker, caught off guard, swerved sharply to avoid being hit, his motorcycle jerking to the left. Emily didn't stop. She accelerated, threading the needle between the lead biker and the one on her right. The sedan shot forward with a growl, its engine louder than it had been all night. For the first time, the bikers weren't leading, they were chasing. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. The men looked disoriented for a split second, but that moment was all she needed. The lead biker was shouting something, though she couldn't hear what. "Let them chase me," she thought, her hands steady on the wheel. "I'll be ready." Emily Dawson wasn't running scared anymore. Because this time, the game had just changed. The bikers didn't let up. Their roaring engines filled the night air, a constant threat pressing in on all sides. Emily's car shot down the empty highway, but they were still there, pushing her, surrounding her, testing her. One of the bikers pulled up beside her window again, his black leather jacket flapping in the wind. He leaned closer, helmet visor down, tapping his knuckles against the glass. Tap. 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 "Hey, sweetheart, where you headed?" he shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. Emily ignored him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead, her hands locked steady on the wheel. Her pulse was racing now, but not from fear. No, it was something else. Something deeper, something her husband always told her. Stay calm. Stay ready. Control is your greatest weapon. The biker knocked again, louder this time. "Don't be shy," he hollered. "We just want to talk." She still didn't look at him. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The two bikers behind her were closing the gap again, inching toward her bumper. The lead biker had caught up, settling into position just ahead of her, forcing her to keep pace with him. They had her surrounded. To them, she must have seemed helpless, a cornered rabbit with no place to run. But they were wrong. Mike's voice returned to her mind, steady and calm. "The moment they underestimate you, you've already won. They're blind to the danger because they can't see past their own arrogance." Emily's grip on the wheel loosened just slightly as her breathing steadied. She wasn't panicking anymore. She was calculating. Think, Emily. What would Mike tell you to do? She knew her options were limited. She couldn't outrun motorcycles in her little sedan, not on these long, empty roads. If she pushed the car too hard, they'd just box her in tighter. She needed to be smarter than that. Emily's gaze shifted to the side mirror again. The biker was still there, his head tilted slightly as if trying to figure her out. "They'll test you," Mike had said once, his eyes serious. "They want to know if you'll break. Don't let them see cracks, even for a second." That's exactly what they were doing now, testing her. Trying to get her to pull over, to stop. But Emily wasn't going to break. The biker ahead of her jerked his motorcycle suddenly, swerving as if to scare her. Emily's car shuddered as she braked lightly, just enough to avoid him. She gritted her teeth, her jaw tight. Every nerve in her body was on edge, but her mind was clear. The memory came back to her: Mike, standing in their living room, calm as ever, explaining the basics of staying in control. "Don't fixate on fear," he had said. "Fear clouds your judgment. Stay aware of everything around you. Keep your options open, and when the time comes, act." Emily's heart settled into a steady rhythm. She ran through her surroundings quickly, mentally cataloging the road, the position of the bikers, and the state of her car. 4 of them. One ahead, one on either side, and one tailing close behind. They'd boxed her in. But there was always a way out. The biker to her left suddenly reached out with one gloved hand and slapped the side of her car. The sound made her flinch involuntarily. Her knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. "Lady, you hear me?" the biker shouted. "You're gonna stop, or we'll stop you." Emily's expression didn't change. But deep inside, something flickered anger. A slow, simmering fire. She thought of Mike again, of the way he'd taught her to handle moments like this. He'd trained her carefully, methodically, turning lessons meant for survival into skills she never thought she'd need. "Sometimes, trouble doesn't wait for you," he'd said. "Sometimes, you have to take control. Surprise them. Make them regret underestimating you." Her husband's words lingered in her mind, giving her strength. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly as she stared at the lead biker in front of her. He seemed so sure of himself, so smug in his control over the situation. But he didn't know what Emily knew. Her mind drifted briefly to the day Mike had first shown her how to defend herself. They'd been out in the backyard. Mike stood across from her, his stance firm, his face serious but encouraging. "You're smaller, Emily," he'd said, "and people will think that means you're weaker. But you don't fight with size, you fight with your brain. You outthink them, outmaneuver them. You're faster, smarter, and you'll catch them off guard." Emily had been skeptical at first, but Mike had insisted. He showed her how to break grips, how to use her surroundings to her advantage, how to stay calm when things got intense. She could still remember the first time she'd taken him by surprise, twisting out of his grasp and countering with the speed he hadn't seen coming. The pride in his eyes had been clear. "That's it," he'd said, grinning. "You're tougher than you think, Emily. Never forget that." Now, here she was. Trapped on a dark road with 4 bikers circling her like vultures. But she wasn't panicking. Not anymore. The biker on her right leaned closer again, trying to peer into the window. He knocked one more time, a sharp and deliberate bang against the glass. "Last chance, lady," he sneered. "Pull over, or we'll make you pull over." Emily's gaze flickered to him briefly. It was just a glance, short and sharp, but it was enough. He hesitated for half a second. Maybe he saw something in her eyes, something that made him wonder. But the moment passed. He straightened up again, revving his engine like a challenge. Emily let out a slow breath. She needed to think fast. Her mind raced through the possibilities. There wasn't much space to maneuver, and the bikers were too close. But Mike had taught her that control didn't always come from physical strength, it came from creating the moment you needed. Suddenly, Emily did something the bikers didn't expect. She eased her foot off the gas. The car slowed just a fraction, not enough to stop, but enough to make them notice. The biker behind her didn't react fast enough. He had been tailing too closely, and when her car dropped its speed slightly, he swerved sharply to avoid hitting her. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of him struggling to keep control of his bike as it wobbled for a moment before steadying. It was small, but it was something. She saw the biker ahead of her turn his head slightly as if checking on his friend. "Disrupt their rhythm," Mike had once told her. "When they're working as a team, break their pattern. They'll stumble. They'll make mistakes." Emily's lips pressed into a firm line. She was ready to fight back. The lead biker, recovering from the brief disruption, raised his left hand and pointed to the side of the road again. It was a silent command: pull over. Emily didn't obey. Instead, her foot pressed down on the gas pedal again, gently at first, testing them. The car's engine hummed louder. The bikers on either side noticed immediately, their helmets turning toward her in unison. "What's she doing?" one of them barked. The lead biker turned sharply and looked over his shoulder, as if trying to understand what she was up to. Emily's breathing stayed calm. Her pulse was steady now. For the first time, she wasn't following their lead. "The best defense is a smart offense," Mike had said. "Take control of the situation, and never let them see it coming." Emily knew she couldn't outrun them, not yet. But she could outthink them. She glanced quickly to the right. The biker there had drifted slightly further away, just enough to give her space. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her hands flexed slightly on the steering wheel. "Wait for it." Her foot hovered over the gas pedal, her mind racing, calculating. "One move. That's all I need." The lead biker was still ahead of her, but he wasn't paying as much attention anymore. They thought they had her figured out, that she was too scared to fight back. Emily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. They were wrong. The sound of the engines roared around her like an angry storm, but Emily's mind was sharp and focused. The biker to her left drifted closer again, still grinning beneath his dark visor. He tapped the window once more, but this time it wasn't playful. It was forceful. Intimidating. "What's your move, Emily? What did Mike say about this?" She could hear Mike's calm voice in her memory, steady and clear as if he were sitting right beside her. "When they push you, don't react emotionally. Don't let anger or fear take over. Focus on what you can control, and the moment to act will come." Emily took another deep breath, steadying her nerves as her fingers flexed slightly over the steering wheel. She stole another glance at the side mirror. The biker had drifted closer than before. He was arrogant, careless, even. He thought she was defenseless, and that was his first mistake. "People who think they're in control will always get sloppy," Mike had once told her. "They stop paying attention to the little details. That's when you strike." The lead biker swerved again, cutting in front of her car, his rear tire so close to her front bumper that Emily could see the worn treads spinning in the dark. He raised his hand, signaling again for her to pull over. Emily stayed silent. She ignored him. Her mind played through the possibilities, all the lessons Mike had drilled into her. The fundamentals of staying calm. The importance of observing everything. The biker to her left seemed to lose patience. He suddenly slapped his hand against the window one more time, harder this time, his knuckles making a crack against the glass. Emily flinched, her reflexes tensing. But her expression didn't change. "Lady," he shouted again through his helmet. "You listening?" He leaned in, close enough now that she could see his face through the visor. His grin was sharp, confident, like someone who thought the game was already won. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Another flashback played in Emily's mind, this time of the first time Mike had taken her to a driving range not to teach her golf, but to show her the power of focus and precision. "Everything's about control," Mike had said, placing her hands on the golf club. "It's not about swinging wildly or trying to overpower anything. It's about finding your balance, your focus. That's what gives you the edge." Back then, Emily had laughed. "What does golf have to do with real life, Mike?" He had only smiled at her. "One day, you'll see." And now, years later, Emily understood exactly what he meant. Control gave her power, and these men didn't know how much of it she still held. She glanced at the road ahead. It was dark and empty, but up in the distance, she spotted a fork in the highway. One road veered right, toward a gas station sign glowing faintly in the darkness, while the other stretched further into the nothingness of the empty night. The bikers didn't know the layout of these roads. But Emily did. That was her advantage. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel again and counted them off silently in her head. One biker ahead of her. Two on her sides. One tailing closely behind. It was risky. Every move was a gamble. But Emily had no other choice. The biker on her left started drifting even closer, his motorcycle's engine roaring as if he wanted to intimidate her. Emily could feel her car tremble slightly under the force of it, but she didn't waver. Then, in a single instant, Emily made her move. Her foot pressed sharply down on the gas pedal. The car's engine growled louder, the sudden burst of speed throwing the bikers off. The one on her left swerved sharply to avoid a collision, and for a second, his motorcycle wobbled. He wasn't expecting her to fight back. The biker in front of her turned his head in surprise, his helmet snapping toward her as she closed the distance between them. For a moment, there was chaos. The biker behind her revved his engine angrily, trying to catch up. The two on her side scrambled to reposition themselves, momentarily thrown off by the sudden speed shift. Emily's heart raced, but her mind stayed clear. "Never hesitate," Mike had said. "When you know what you need to do, you do it." The fork in the road was only moments away now. She could see the faint glow of the gas station sign up ahead. Her plan was risky, but she didn't have time to overthink it. Emily swerved the wheel sharply to the right, jerking her car toward the exit ramp. Her tires screeched against the pavement as the sudden motion threw her car into a new path. The bikers reacted immediately, their engines roaring louder as they scrambled to follow. The biker to her left veered wide, trying to catch up to her, but in his haste, his rear tire caught a patch of gravel near the edge of the road. The motorcycle skidded slightly, wobbling before the biker managed to regain control. Emily didn't look back. She kept her focus ahead, pushing the car down the narrow ramp toward the gas station. "Keep moving," Mike's voice echoed in her head. "Momentum is everything." As Emily sped toward the gas station, her pulse quickened. It wasn't over yet. The gas station sat at the edge of the exit ramp like an oasis of light in the dark, empty night. There were two small trucks parked in front, their lights off, but the station itself was otherwise deserted. The lead biker had caught up again, his motorcycle roaring alongside her car. He motioned with one hand for the others to follow as he swerved closer, his engine growling like a predator closing in. Emily knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to trap her again, box her in at the station where she'd have no choice but to stop. But Emily had no intention of stopping. She turned the wheel sharply, guiding the car into the gas station's parking lot. Her tires crunched against the gravel as she swerved around the edge of the building. For a split second, she disappeared from view, the building shielding her from the bikers. And that was when she acted. Emily slammed the brakes, bringing the car to a sudden, screeching stop behind the building. The back tires skidded slightly, the force of the stop jolting her forward. She threw the car into park, her breathing shallow as she listened. The bikers' motorcycles roared past the building on the other side, their engines echoing loudly in the night as they missed her entirely. They didn't know she'd stopped. They thought she was still moving. Emily sat perfectly still for a moment, her hands trembling slightly now as the adrenaline caught up with her. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she stayed quiet. The motorcycles faded into the distance, their angry growls growing fainter as the bikers raced down the road, searching for her. They hadn't seen her slip behind the station. They hadn't realized she was already out of their sight. Mike's words rang in her ears once more, steady and reassuring. "When they don't see you coming, they've already lost." Emily let out a slow breath as silence returned to the night. She checked the rearview mirror one last time, scanning for any sign of movement. Nothing. For now, the bikers were gone. Her pulse slowed as she reached for her phone on the passenger seat. Her fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to call Mike or the police first. The choice was clear: Mike. She dialed his number, pressing the phone to her ear as it rang once, then twice. When his voice came through on the other end, it was calm, familiar, and steady. "Emily." Mike's tone shifted instantly. You okay? Emily exhaled slowly, a small smile touching her lips as she answered. I handled it, she said quietly. Just like you taught me. The growl of engines shattered the silence as the bikers came back into view. Emily had watched them circle back, realizing they hadn't given up. They were predators, closing in for what they thought was an easy kill. The leader, with his dark leather jacket and scuffed helmet, cut the engine and slid off his bike first. The others followed suit, their boots crunching against the gravel as they surrounded her car. Emily sat quietly in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as her mind processed the scene. 4 bikers. 4 men who thought she was alone. 4 men who thought they held all the power. They were wrong. The leader swaggered toward her car door, confidence oozing from every step. The others spread out, fanning around the vehicle as if to block every possible escape. Their movements were deliberate, arrogant. He stopped just short of the driver's side window and tapped his knuckles against the glass, harder this time. Tap. 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 Emily didn't move. She kept her breathing steady, her pulse under control. The biker leaned closer, the visor of his helmet catching the faint glow of the gas station lights. Slowly, he tilted his head to peer through the window. His grin was back, wide and confident. Come on out, sweetheart, he said, his voice muffled by the helmet. No need to be shy. Another biker to her right chuckled. Maybe she's scared. Emily didn't react. She glanced briefly at the rearview mirror, watching the biker who was hanging back behind her car, hands resting casually on his belt. He was waiting, watching for an opening. Her mind clicked through everything she saw, every detail mattered. Mike's voice played in her memory, soft but firm, when you're outnumbered, don't panic. Most people lose because they freeze. You don't freeze, Emily. You calculate. You act. The leader's patience wore thin. He reached down for the door handle. That was his first mistake. As soon as his fingers curled around it, Emily sprang into motion. She slammed her palm down on the horn, the sudden blaring noise exploding through the quiet night. The biker flinched, jerking back, instinctively caught off guard. In that same instant, Emily's foot shot to the gas pedal. The car jolted forward with a screech of tires, its rear end spinning slightly as she swung it into a sharp turn. The biker standing behind her car had to jump out of the way, cursing loudly as gravel scattered. The other bikers scrambled back toward their motorcycles, startled by her sudden move. But Emily wasn't done. The leader, stunned for only a moment, shouted something unintelligible and yanked off his helmet. His face was red with anger as he turned to his crew. Get her. Now. The bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, engines roaring to life again. But Emily had already positioned her car near the edge of the parking lot, where a narrow dirt road led off into the dark. Stay unpredictable, Mike had always told her. They can't trap you if they don't know what you'll do next. Emily's heart raced, but her focus was laser sharp. She flicked the headlights off and shifted the car into reverse. Her tires skidded as she backed up fast, angling her car so that the gas station building sat between her and the bikers. The dirt road loomed ahead like a shadowy escape route, but she wasn't leaving. Not yet. The bikers split up, their engines rumbling as they spread out to search for her. One peeled off to the left, circling behind the gas station. Another veered toward the far side of the lot. They didn't realize they were walking straight into her hands. Emily's breathing steadied as she shifted into drive and rolled the car forward, slow and silent. Her headlights stayed off, keeping her hidden in the dark. Her thoughts were clear. Her movements deliberate. One of the bikers finally spotted her. There she is, he yelled, his voice echoing in the night. The leader swerved around the building and skidded to a stop in front of her car. His bike's headlight blazed like a spotlight, pinning her in place. For a second, the scene froze. The leader climbed off his bike again, his face twisted with frustration. He marched toward her car, this time not bothering to speak. His intentions were clear. The others closed in from all sides, their bikes rumbling like an angry mob. But Emily was ready. She opened the car door and stepped out. The bikers paused. It wasn't what they were expecting. Emily stood tall, her posture unnervingly calm. She was still wearing her simple clothes, a pair of jeans and a plain sweater, but something in the way she carried herself made the group hesitate. The leader narrowed his eyes, trying to understand the shift. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, voice sharp with irritation. "You really think getting out of the car was a good idea, lady?" Emily didn't flinch. Her expression stayed unreadable as she looked him straight in the eyes. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice even. The leader barked a laugh, turning to his men. "You hear that? She thinks we're the ones making a mistake." The others chuckled, the sound bouncing off the empty lot. But the laughter didn't last long. Because Emily took a step forward. And that's when everything changed. In a flash, Emily lunged to the side, snatching up a handful of gravel from the ground. Before the leader could react, she threw it with precision right into his eyes. He shouted, stumbling backward as his hands shot up to his face. The unexpected attack threw the others into momentary chaos. "Hey," one of the bikers shouted. "What?" But before he could finish, Emily was already moving again. Mike's lessons echoed in her mind: use the environment. Use surprise. They'll never see it coming. She ducked low and sprinted toward the biker closest to her. He wasn't ready, his hands were still on his belt, and his feet weren't braced. Emily's shoulder slammed into his midsection, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, gasping as he hit the ground with a heavy thud. The remaining bikers snapped out of their shock. "Get her," one of them yelled. But it was too late. Emily spun toward the gas station building, where an old metal pipe rested near the wall. She grabbed it, her movements smooth and decisive. The next biker charged at her, overconfident. Emily sidestepped his swing and brought the pipe up in a sharp arc. It connected with his forearm, and he cried out, dropping to his knees. The leader, still blinded by gravel, cursed loudly. "What the hell is happening?" Emily didn't stop. She turned to the final biker, the youngest of the group, who now hesitated as he watched his friends crumple one by one. "You really want to keep this up?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The biker froze, glancing between her and his fallen friends. He seemed to realize too late that she wasn't what they'd assumed. This wasn't a helpless woman. This was someone trained, prepared. Someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. The leader finally cleared his eyes, but when he looked around, the scene was unrecognizable. His crew, the men he counted on, were scattered, groaning, kneeling, or silent. And standing in the center of it all, completely calm, was Emily. She held the metal pipe loosely at her side, her posture relaxed but commanding. The leader stumbled forward, rage twisting his face. "Who are you?" he spat. Emily met his gaze, her expression unshaken. "I'm someone who's had enough of men like you," she said evenly. "Now get your crew, get on your bikes, and leave." The leader hesitated, his fists clenched. "Or what?" he challenged. Emily took a single step closer, her eyes hard. "Or I make sure you regret every decision that brought you here." The leader stared at her, his bravado wavering. He could see it now, the quiet confidence, the steady breathing, the readiness in her stance. This wasn't a bluff. This woman was dangerous. And he knew it. Finally, without another word, the leader turned sharply toward his men. "Get up," he barked. "We're leaving." The bikers scrambled, limping toward their motorcycles. The engines roared back to life as they peeled out of the parking lot, disappearing into the night. Emily watched them go, her breathing finally slowing as the silence settled back over the empty gas station. She dropped the metal pipe, letting it clang softly against the ground. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, Mike's name lighting up the screen. She smiled faintly as Mike's name lit up the screen, and Emily swiped to answer, her voice calm despite everything that had just unfolded. "Hey," she said quietly. There was a brief pause before his steady voice came through. "You okay, Em?" Emily glanced around the empty parking lot, the sound of the motorcycles now distant, nothing but silence and the hum of the gas station lights remaining. She exhaled softly, letting the tension finally drain out of her shoulders. "I'm fine," she replied. "Had a little situation. But it's over now." Mike's voice sharpened, though not with panic. "What happened?" Emily walked toward her car and leaned against the door, the cool metal grounding her after the intensity of the last few minutes. She explained the encounter briefly, how they had followed her, surrounded her, and then underestimated her. She didn't add unnecessary dramatics, she didn't need to. Mike, of all people, understood what moments like this meant. There was a beat of silence on his end. Then a low chuckle. "I told you, didn't I? People never see you coming." Emily smiled faintly. "Yeah, well, they sure didn't tonight." Mike's tone grew more serious, though there was still a touch of pride in his voice. "You handled yourself, Em. Like I knew you would." Emily leaned her head back against the car, looking up at the vast, empty sky. The adrenaline had left her limbs feeling a little shaky now, but she knew she'd done what was necessary. She hadn't let fear win. She hadn't let them win. "They didn't expect me to fight back," she murmured, almost to herself. "They thought I'd just be scared and stay scared." "That's the thing about people like that," Mike replied, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "They only know how to prey on weakness. They never expect strength from the ones they've already written off." Emily considered that for a moment, the truth of his words settling over her like a blanket. Those men had seen her as vulnerable because she was a woman alone in a small car, minding her own business. They had thought that appearance equaled weakness. They'd thought they could intimidate her, push her around, and get away with it. But appearances could lie. And Emily had proved that tonight. "I just did what you taught me," she said softly, still looking at the stars. "Stay calm. Stay ready. Use surprise. That's all it took." Mike's voice softened. "That's because you're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Emily." Emily felt the faintest warmth in her chest at his words. Mike always said things like that, not in a way that flattered her, but in a way that reminded her of who she really was. He had seen her strength long before she had ever believed it herself. "Get back on the road when you're ready," Mike added, his voice anchoring her. "And drive safe, all right? Call me when you get home." "I will," Emily said with a small smile. "Love you." "Love you too, Em." She ended the call, letting the phone rest against her palm as she stared out at the quiet night. It felt strange how quickly the chaos had ended, how the world could return to normal so suddenly, as if the encounter had never even happened. But it had happened. And Emily would carry the memory of tonight with her for a long time. After a moment, she climbed back into the car, locking the doors with a faint click. Her hands still tingled with energy, but she steadied herself, placing them on the steering wheel. She glanced into the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see the glowing headlights of motorcycles in the distance. But there was nothing. Just darkness. Satisfied, she started the engine and pulled out of the gas station lot, taking one last look at the scattered gravel on the pavement where the bikers had fallen. As she merged back onto the highway, the miles stretching out in front of her, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet confidence, a steady calm she hadn't known she possessed. It was as though a piece of her had clicked into place tonight, a part of her that Mike had always believed in but she had never truly tested until now. She thought back to the faces of the bikers when they realized their mistake, when they realized she was the one in control. The disbelief. The confusion. The anger that slowly gave way to fear. They had expected someone who would freeze, someone helpless. Instead, they'd gotten someone who fought back. Emily's mind drifted to the past as the hum of the engine filled the car. She remembered the first time Mike had taken her to the training field near the base. He had been patient, his approach gentle but firm. She'd protested at first, thinking it was unnecessary. She wasn't a soldier, after all. She was a professor, a book lover, someone who spent her days teaching college students about themes and symbols. But Mike had been unrelenting. You don't have to be a soldier to know how to defend yourself, he had told her that day. The world doesn't care about your titles or your job. Trouble doesn't ask who you are, it just comes. You need to know what to do when it finds you. At the time, his words had seemed a little dramatic. But tonight, those lessons had saved her. She thought back to the drills they'd done together, how he'd taught her to control her breathing, to stay calm under pressure. How he'd made her practice over and over until it felt like second nature. At the time, she hadn't realized how deeply it had all taken root, but tonight, it had all come back to her instinctively. Emily's headlights cut through the darkness of the road ahead, the steady rhythm of the tires against the pavement soothing her. She felt different now, stronger, steadier. The encounter with the bikers could have broken her, could have left her shaking in fear, afraid of every shadow on the road. Instead, it had shown her just how much strength she had buried inside her. She knew she wasn't invincible. She was still just Emily, a professor, a wife, a woman who loved quiet mornings and old books. But tonight, she had been something more. She had been prepared. She had been capable. She had taken control when everything seemed stacked against her. The bikers had seen her as an easy target. They had chosen her because they thought she was weak. But what they'd learned too late was that underestimating someone was the biggest mistake of all. Hours later, Emily pulled into her driveway, the house dark and still. She cut the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around her. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her tired but at peace. She knew Mike would be waiting inside, probably sitting on the couch with a book or watching the news. He'd have that look in his eyes when he saw her, the one that said, "I knew you could handle it," without him needing to say a word. Emily climbed out of the car and walked up the front steps, the events of the night settling in her mind like pieces of a story she'd one day tell carefully, and maybe even with a touch of humor. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the soft glow of the living room lamp. Sure enough, Mike was there, waiting for her, his book resting open in his lap. He looked up as she entered, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Hey," he said softly, studying her face. "Hey," Emily replied, setting down her keys and walking over to sit beside him. Mike tilted his head slightly, a teasing glint in his eyes. "Rough night?" Emily huffed out a small laugh, the kind that came from relief. "You could say that." He didn't press her for details. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached over and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You did good," he said simply. Emily smiled faintly, leaning her head against his shoulder. For the first time all night, she let herself relax completely, feeling safe in the comfort of home. "Yeah," she murmured. "I did." And in that quiet moment, she realized something important: she would never let anyone else decide who she was or what she was capable of. She had faced trouble head on, and she had won not because of luck, but because she'd been ready. And next time trouble came knocking, if it ever did again, she'd be ready then, too. Because strength wasn't about size or toughness or appearances. It was about something deeper. And Emily knew, now more than ever, that she had it. The bikers were scattered across the asphalt, two of them groaning in pain, clutching their bruised bodies. The other two, who had remained on their bikes, hesitated, glancing back at Emily. The once fearless, cocky expressions had faded, replaced by visible hesitation and embarrassment. Emily stood still, her posture unyielding. She hadn't moved from the spot where she had first stopped the car, and she wasn't going to. The biker who had tried to grab the door handle earlier, he was the first to move. He shot a glance at his fallen comrades, a look of frustration and confusion crossing his face. But the look that followed was something else entirely: fear. He didn't make any sudden movements. Instead, he revved the engine of his motorcycle, his knuckles tightening on the handlebar. For a brief moment, there was silence. It was as if the world had paused to witness what would happen next. Then, with a grunt of frustration, the biker turned the throttle, his tires spinning as he sped off, the roar of his motorcycle filling the air. The second biker followed suit, his eyes locked on Emily's unblinking stare, and just before he tore off, he glanced back once more. The pride was gone. In its place, something much deeper, more instinctive: fear. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. Emily watched them go, her breathing steady, her body still, her heart calm. She had stood her ground. They had expected her to crumble, to run, or maybe even beg for mercy. But Emily wasn't that person. Not anymore. She glanced down at her hand resting on the hood of her car. The knuckles were still a little white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, but the tightness in her chest had eased. The world around her seemed to grow quieter now, the rumble of the motorcycles fading into the distance. It was over. Emily didn't feel the rush of adrenaline anymore. Instead, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The bikers had retreated, humiliated. But she had walked away victorious. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Mike. "You all right?" She smiled softly, shaking her head as she pulled the phone from her pocket. Her fingers danced over the screen as she typed her reply. "I'm good. They didn't expect me to fight back." Mike's reply came almost immediately. "I knew you wouldn't let them win. Stay safe. I'm proud of you." Emily's heart warmed at his words. He'd always believed in her. And tonight, she'd proven him right. But the moment wasn't over yet. As she stood there, gathering her thoughts, the sound of sirens reached her ears. Her head turned just as a police car pulled into the parking lot, followed by a second one. Two officers stepped out of their cars, looking around at the scene before their eyes fell on Emily. One of the officers, tall, with a sharp jawline and an air of authority, approached her first. He looked at the bikes, the two fallen men on the ground, and then back at Emily, his gaze assessing. His hand rested on his holster, but there was no sign of aggression, just professional curiosity. "Ma'am, you okay?" he asked. Emily nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I'm fine. They tried to harass me, but I was able to defend myself. They're gone now." The officer's gaze flickered to the bikers, then back to her. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking. "Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Emily repeated. "They're the ones who need help. Two of them are down, but nothing serious, I think." The officer raised an eyebrow at that. "What happened exactly?" Emily took a breath, her eyes scanning the distance where the bikers had vanished. "They followed me. Tried to intimidate me. But I didn't back down." She didn't feel the need to add any more details. The bikers' retreat spoke for itself. The officer seemed to consider her words, then nodded, signaling for the second officer to call in the paramedics. As the second officer walked toward the two bikers still lying on the ground, the first officer turned back to Emily. "I'm going to need a statement from you," he said. "Just in case we need to file a report." Of course, Emily replied, pulling out her ID and showing it to him. She was more than willing to explain what had happened, though she had the feeling this wouldn't be the first time the bikers would find themselves in trouble. As the officer took down her information, Emily could feel the weight of the situation starting to sink in. She had handled herself. And in the process, she had done more than just stand her ground. She had stood tall, and that made all the difference. It didn't take long for the police to assess the situation. One of the officers took photos of the scene while the other made calls. The bikers, still dazed but now sobered by their defeat, were handcuffed and led to the police cars. Emily noticed that their once threatening postures were gone. They slouched as they walked, their bravado melted away. As the officers spoke to the bikers, Emily took a moment to herself, standing alone in the parking lot, her hands resting at her sides. The cool air felt refreshing after everything she'd been through. She'd been terrified when the bikers had first surrounded her. She'd feared for her safety, but she hadn't let that fear control her. And now, she stood there, feeling stronger than she ever had before. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Mike. "You sure you're all right? Don't want you to think you have to handle everything alone." Emily's lips curved into a smile as she typed her reply. "I'm fine. Just waiting for the cops to finish up. You taught me well, Mike. I wasn't alone out there." His response was swift. "I'm proud of you. You always had it in you." She felt her chest tighten at the warmth in his words. For a moment, she let herself soak in the quiet victory. She had handled the bikers, she had faced the danger head-on, and now, she was safe. She wasn't just Emily Dawson, the quiet college professor. She was someone who could stand her ground, someone who could protect herself and those she loved. And as the bikers were loaded into the police cars and driven away, Emily knew they would think twice before ever harassing another stranger. They had come looking for an easy target and had found out the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. She stood there for a while longer, watching the flashing lights of the police cars fade into the distance. The night was peaceful again, the only sounds now the quiet rustling of leaves and the hum of distant traffic. As Emily climbed back into her car, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't known she was capable of. It wasn't about the bikers or the danger. It was about the realization that she could handle whatever came her way. And most importantly, she knew that she didn't need anyone else to define her strength. As she drove home, the road stretched ahead of her, empty and calm. The world was still, and she felt a sense of peace. She was ready for whatever came next because she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would face it head on. Just as she always had. And with Mike by her side, she would always be prepared for whatever challenge the world threw her way. Back at home, Mike was waiting for her, just as he always did. The moment she stepped inside, he didn't ask any questions. He didn't need to. He knew his wife. He knew what she was capable of. Emily didn't say much about what had happened, but when he looked into her eyes, he saw the quiet strength there, the kind that had been built over years of love, trust, and training. And that, he thought, was all that mattered. The world could try to break her down, but Emily Dawson wasn't someone who could be defeated. She had the strength to stand up for herself and for anyone else who needed her. And that was something no one could take away from her. Emily's car hummed steadily along the road as she made her way home, the soft glow of the streetlights flickering in her rearview mirror. The night felt peaceful now, almost as if nothing had happened at all. The only evidence of the chaos that had unfolded just hours ago was the faint sound of her tires against the asphalt, steady and rhythmic. But inside, Emily knew that everything had changed. Not just because of what she'd faced with those bikers, but because of what she had proven to herself. It wasn't the speed with which she had acted or the strength she had displayed that mattered. It was the calm that had carried her through. It was the quiet assurance that had come from knowing exactly what to do, not because of luck, but because she had been prepared. The lessons her husband Mike had taught her, the small tips and tricks, the stories of his own struggles and victories, had always seemed like little things. And yet, in that moment, they had been everything. She hadn't needed to shout or make a scene. She had simply stood her ground and taken control when the time came. As she drove, Emily thought about the bikers, the ones who had believed they could intimidate her. They had thought she was an easy target, that her quiet nature and the modest car she drove meant she was weak, harmless even. They hadn't understood that strength wasn't always loud or obvious. Strength wasn't about muscle or threats. Sometimes, it was about staying calm, keeping your head clear, and knowing when to act. Emily wasn't the person they had thought she was. And now, they would remember her. They would remember the woman who didn't fold under pressure, who didn't scream or run away. They would remember how she had turned the situation around, how she had stayed in control. It wasn't just about stopping them from harassing her, it was about showing them that no one could push her around, no matter who they were. The road ahead of her stretched out, dark and quiet. The houses on either side were lit by the soft glow of porch lights, the world calm in the night's embrace. But Emily knew, as she looked out at the world passing by, that it wasn't just the road that had changed. It was her. The way she saw herself, the way she understood her own strength, her own resilience. Her mind wandered back to Mike's words. Stay calm. Stay ready. It had always seemed like simple advice. But now, it felt like a mantra, a reminder of everything she was capable of. It was as if she had been preparing for that moment for years, and she hadn't even known it. Everything Mike had taught her, every lesson he had shared, had been for this. For her to be ready for whatever life threw her way. There was a power in that preparation. It was the power of knowing that even in the most difficult moments, you didn't have to rely on anyone else to save you. You could save yourself. You could stand tall, face your fears, and walk away knowing that you had done it on your own terms. As she neared her house, the familiar sight of the porch light welcoming her home brought a sense of warmth and comfort. She pulled into the driveway and parked the car, taking a moment to sit in silence. The quiet stillness of the night felt like a victory. It wasn't just the bikers who had learned something, it was everyone who had ever doubted her. And it was herself, too. She had learned that she was more than just the quiet professor, more than just the woman who smiled politely at the world. She was a force in her own right. She stepped out of the car and walked to the door, the night air cool against her skin. She didn't need to rush inside, she didn't need anyone to tell her she had done well. She knew it already. She had faced down fear and come out stronger on the other side. And no one could take that away from her. Inside, Mike was waiting, as always. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to. His eyes met hers, and in that look, she saw the pride, the understanding. He knew exactly what she had done. And he knew that she didn't need him to fight for her. She was more than capable of fighting for herself. As she walked into the living room, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. There would be no more worrying about what others thought of her. No more wondering if she was enough. Emily Dawson had proven, without a doubt, that she was more than enough. Mike stood up from the couch and walked over to her, his arms open. "You did great," he said softly. Emily smiled, grateful for his support, but also proud of herself. She didn't need his approval to know that she had done what was right. She had faced her fears, trusted her instincts, and stood her ground. She had shown herself, and the world, what she was made of. The room was quiet, but it felt full. It felt full of everything Emily had learned, everything she had overcome, and everything she knew she could still achieve. There was a power in knowing who you were, in understanding your worth, and in trusting that no matter what came your way, you could face it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was to stay calm and take action. The loudest roar was not always the most dangerous sound. It was the quiet, steady voice that came from within, the one that knew exactly how to handle whatever life threw at you. Emily's thoughts settled, and a final realization came to her. The world had tried to define her. It had tried to fit her into a box of quietness, meekness, and submission. But Emily wasn't interested in fitting into any box. She was writing her own story, and no one, no biker, no bully, no obstacle could take that from her. As she sat down on the couch next to Mike, she looked out the window at the night sky, calm and peaceful. There would be other challenges ahead, other tests, other moments of fear or doubt. But Emily knew now that she didn't have to be afraid. She had the strength to face them all. And no matter what came next, she would do it in her own way, quiet, steady, and sure. Because power doesn't always roar, it often speaks in silence and action.